I'm Stephanie Salazar, Outreach and Education Program Manager for the University of Michigan Depression Center. And on behalf of our Conference Planning Committee co-chairs, Dr. John Graydon, Todd Sevig, and Daniel Eisenberg, and the entire Conference Planning Committee, I'd like to welcome you to the 16th Annual Depression on College Campuses Conference, redesigning structures, spaces, and processes to promote wellness. I'm really looking forward to a good conference today. A few special notes about our opening keynote presentation. This year, for the first time, we've been able to offer APA CME credits for it. So if you need those, please check in at the registration desk that you saw when you came in. For all others, you do not need to sign in for this session. Just sign in and out of your concurrent sessions. Secondly, and most importantly, we are honored that today's opening keynote also serves as the annual John F. Graydon Scholar in Residence Lecture. I will tell you a little bit about the history of this lecture, and then we'll have Dr. John Graydon introduce the speaker himself. In 2007, after more than 22 years, John F. Graydon stepped down as the chair of the Department of Psychiatry to devote his efforts to his role as executive director of the Depression Center. A widely respected leader, Graydon led the department with consummate vision and commitment, reinforcing UM's position in the forefront of academic psychiatry. Following his tenure as chair, Graydon continued his leadership of the University of Michigan Comprehensive Depression Center, the inaugural center of excellence of its kind, and is the founding chair of the National Network of Depression Centers. The NNDC now consists of 26 centers dedicated to sharing data to conquer mood disorders. To honor Graydon for his exceptional contributions, the Department of Psychiatry established the John F. Graydon Scholar in Residence program, providing an ongoing opportunity to pay tribute to Dr. Graydon for his leadership, mentorship, and academic achievements. This program allows a distinguished expert in depression and other mood disorders to spend time at each year. The Graydon Scholar delivers a lecture, meets with faculty and trainees, and expands the department's focus on the study and treatment of depressive illnesses. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. John Graydon to the stage.
Hello, everyone, and Stephanie, thank you for that very warm introduction for me. It seems funny to be honored and then sort of trying to do the honoring. I have the privilege and the pleasure to introduce Dr. Thomas Insel. That's my role today, rather than the rest of it, and I will do that very briefly so we can listen to him. Dr. Insel is a psychiatrist, a neuroscientist, and now is currently, for those of you who wish to go look it up, the co-founder and president of MindStrong Health. Dr. Insel previously served for 13 years as the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, known to us as NIMH. This is the component of NIH that's committed to brain research, trauma genetics, mental disorders, whatever term you use, but behavioral health, but it's really essential and vital. For those of you who don't know what the World Health Organization just declared about 14 months ago now, that the number one cause of disability from medical illnesses, all of the medical illnesses in the world, is clinical depression. So we started this conference 16 years ago with the aim of trying to do some things on college campuses. By that designation from WHO, we still have an awful lot to do. Prior to his NIH role, Tom was a professor of psychiatry at Emory. He was the founding director of the Center for Behavioral Neuroscience in Atlanta. And then when he departed from NIMH, he essentially went west into Silicon Valley and led the mental health team at Verily, which was formerly Google Life Sciences. So he's still there, but now with MindStrong Health. Tom's a member of the National Academy of Medicine. He's received numerous national and international awards, including honorary degrees in the US and Europe, and I'm not going to spend time on them because it would take all of our time. I could go on accolades, but I have one more little anecdote. when we started this conference, probably 16 years ago now, I think the second or the third one, Tom was actually a speaker. So he was here then talking about a different aspect. Please join me in welcoming back and thanking Dr. Tom Insel.
Well, thanks so much, John. What a pleasure to come back. I don't know if we were in this room. Okay. We were, okay. Well, in any case, I don't remember what I said, but it must have been something that you liked enough to bring me back all these years later, or maybe it was something you didn't like, but so you waited many, many years hoping it'd be better. But what I want to talk about in the next 40 minutes maybe is around technology and what it may be able to do to help us with what John was just saying, is this becoming increasingly urgent issue around depression on college campuses. Because this is a CME talk, let me begin with some disclosures. I have equity in a number of companies and sit on various boards, both for-profit and not-profit. Importantly, there are two of them, 7 Cups and MindStrong Health, that I will talk about specifically in terms of their promise for doing something for depression. I don't think either of them really have a commercial product at this stage, so I can't hawk that, but I do think you should be informed about that particular bias that I may have. When I talk about a project like this or a problem like this, I often take the advice of Tom Friedman, who's somebody I like a lot, op-ed writer for the New York Times, who sits around often and says, what kind of a world are we living in? And the way I often think about this is to divide the world we're in now into these political, economic, scientific, and cultural forces. And sometimes it's useful just to step back a little bit and think about these externalities that have some kind of an influence on the problems we're trying to solve. And I won't go into each of these, but as you take a look through all of these different segments, I think you'll begin to see that many of them do influence the question about what to do around campus life and how to address depression, and maybe the two very recent ones, the issues around school violence, kids increasingly describing themselves as the school shooting generation, which I think is sobering to hear, and most recently this sort of possibility that with new tariffs and with changes in trade, we may be into a really profoundly, rapidly changing economic situation. So these are all aspects of the world we live in that are going to be relevant for what we really want to focus on here, which is the changing ecosystem of campus life. What I want to suggest is that we don't know all of the things that are driving this increase in the demand for psychological services on campus and the increase in suicide, increase in psychopathology, both treated and untreated. We have a sense that there are a few issues that are probably prevalent. One is that it seems that increasingly students who may not have made it to a university, at least a university that involved leaving home, are increasingly able to do that because the good news is they're treated better. They're often in care from the time they're in middle school or even before. I heard a figure last week that something like 30% of the students entering one particular unnamed university, but very large, well-respected university, 30% of the kids had been on medication from middle school, which is just extraordinary in the sense that many of those kids would not have attended, but also just to give you a feel for how different that is from where we would have been 2 or 3 decades ago. It's also true that we've also often talked about stigma as what keeps people out of treatment, and for whatever reason, that seems to be less than it was. And so there's an increasing willingness for students to talk about those issues and to seek help from them. I think the key that this and almost every other campus is struggling with at this point is that while all this is changing, we haven't yet created the supply to match that demand. That is, we don't have the workforce in place. And it's probably even worse than we think it is. UCLA, and you'll hear in the closing remarks tomorrow from someone at UCLA, part of the Depression Grand Challenge Initiative, which is really a spectacular effort to enroll 100,000 people with depression. But they've looked on the UCLA campus itself, and they did this online screening of about 3,500 students back in September. And immediately they had 102 that triggered the suicide alert, which is kind of stunning. Almost none of these kids were actually in care, or almost none of them were kind of in anybody's sights as needing to get care. About 700, which is about what you might expect, about 1 in 5, sought online help with internet CBT. So there's a lot out there that we don't even know about yet that fortunately we now are beginning to try to identify through opportunities like this, so we can move upstream and sort of hopefully preempt the adverse events like a suicide attempt or an overdose. But this is not a problem that's going to go away by itself. Actually, the group from Penn State has coordinated a lot of efforts to try to capture some of the data of what's going on across the country. If you haven't seen this report, the Center for Collegiate Mental Health, definitely worth looking at. You can Google that title and it'll come up as a PDF. Huge amount of data within there. USA Today about a year ago tried to just summarize some of what's in there, and I put up their graphs because I think they provide some fairly decent summary of the major points. And just look at this, that something like only half of the counseling centers have any sort of accreditation within universities and colleges across the country. That when you look at psychiatric services provided, only about 13% of campuses have a full-time person available for students. Fully, almost, 31% here have essentially no services that they're offering. And when you look at what students are coming in for, it's not just school issues and family issues, but the biggest issues are, in fact, depression and anxiety. No surprise to anybody in this room. So what's the problem? Or what's driving this? One idea is that it's this, that the problem is really around the increasing disconnection from all of the connectivity that people have through Facebook and other social media sites. And some of you will know this book that's a New York Times bestseller by Jean Twenge at UCSD on what she calls the iGen, this generation of kids who have grown up on phones. And she talks about how adolescents today have lower rates of teen pregnancy, lower rates of auto accidents. In fact, they have lower rates of getting driver's licenses. They don't actually want to leave home to go anywhere because they're connecting with everybody by sitting in their bedroom and using Facebook or another social media site. And she worries about how much that has contributed to the fact that kids no longer know how to interact face-to-face, and the shock they have when they leave home and they end up in a dormitory environment where they actually have to live with somebody who's not just a virtual avatar or virtual friend. And certainly we've seen some of this in what people are writing about in terms of campus. The solution has generally been something like this, that if we can increase the size of our counseling centers, increase the number of people, and improve the quality of people available to students, that we'll kind of work our way out of this. Maybe the other way of thinking about this is to really question whether what we thought was the problem could, in fact, in some ways be the solution. And that's what I want to focus on for the next few minutes, because my experience of having done this for a long time, is that engagement is maybe 70% of the battle here, is getting people actually involved in some sort of treatment setting. But I will hasten to add that the treatment settings that we have built are largely built for us and not for the people we want to serve. They're built on our terms. They're built by a generation that is really obsessed with brick and mortar and with scheduling and with a world that doesn't really fit that well for students today. In a way, we're sort of the shopping mall generation and not the Amazon generation. And we've got to rethink our treatment strategies to deal with what would Amazon Prime think about this? How would they manage the delivery of services? More about that in a few minutes. Let's talk about the phone and what we can do with that. It's an amazing thing to realize that we're walking around, all of us, with these very powerful computers. Those of us who are old enough to remember the Cray supercomputer, the last of the Cray supercomputers was less powerful than the iPhone 6. So we're talking about a phenomenal amount of computational power that we all have sitting in our pockets. And it's remarkable how much these are getting used by everyone. In fact, that's why people assume that this is so much the heart of the problem. The numbers are phenomenal. 3 billion phones currently in circulation, smartphones, expected to go up to 6 billion with, as you can see from this graph, or maybe it's a little hard to read, but the biggest part of this will be in Asia and India. The US, at least for students of college age, is well over 92%. That was in 2016. I suspect by now it's closer to 97 or 98% saturation. But it's not just the fact that these are ubiquitous, but that we use them so much, and especially for students under the age of 25, where you're getting not 2,600 daily touches, but probably a number that's tenfold higher than that. I have to tell you, the ubiquity of this is still kind of stunning to me. My wife and I just came back from 2 weeks in Tanzania, in some very remote areas of what's called Maasai land, which is the area that's the natural habitat for about 1 million Maasai. These are very proud people, but up until 30 years ago, they never let their children go to school because they needed the kids to be herders. They herd cows, sheep, and goats. And that's still very much true, although more and more of these kids are going to school. But we were interested in how this society is evolving. And I was stunned to run into a Maasai warrior on a hillside who, inside the shuka, that red robe that they all wear, was packing a Samsung phone and using that many, many times a day while he's out on the hillside. And I asked, well, what do you do with it? He said, well, I really like this Chrome browser. It's fantastic because it connects me to so many things. I get all kinds of information from all over. I said, well, are you able to get service here? He said, yeah, actually, it's amazing. The service is actually probably better than it is in parts of Michigan. So remarkable how the world is changing. The Maasai culture has a whole sort of cohort element to it. When you go through this manhood ritual, you become part of an age group cohort that stays together throughout your life, and they are sort of extended family. And I asked him about that, and he said, yeah, we all stay in touch through Facebook. It's the coolest thing that we're able to use that now. Now, he couldn't speak, this was all translated through, Maasai have their own language, which is not written down, but I had a Swahili interpreter who could understand Maasai. But it just gives you a sense of how global this has become all of a sudden, really within the last, well, the iPhone is 10 years old, so you get some idea of how quickly this has happened. So will this change what we do for mental health? And if so, how? There's a lot going on here, and for me, the best way to kind of explain this and to try to get my hands around it is to divide it into 3 categories of technology development. One is around what we call digital phenotyping, which is using digital tools for a better description of behavior and cognition. And that includes the sensors, the human-computer interaction. I'll tell you what that is in a moment. Looking at voice and speech, looking at sociality. Sorry, the Y dropped out there. But those are looking at calls out versus calls in, texts out versus texts in, a very simple measure of are people staying socially connected or not, even if that kind of connection may not be the healthiest thing for us. Mobile interventions, and all of you know about this. This is the telehealth revolution, the ability to use, to deliver CBT and various other forms of coaching and therapy online. And then care management as a kind of a new approach to changing the quality of care through better care coordination and data capture. Let's walk through these really quickly so I can give you a sense of what each of them might look like. Start with this business about phenotyping, better descriptions of mood, cognition, and behavior. What we do now in the non-digital sense is not great. It's subjective, it's episodic, it's clinic-based, it's effortful, it's the PHQ-9 at best, which is better than what we were doing a few years ago and is still, it doesn't have a deep penetration. But if you look at what this questionnaire does, it's a self-report questionnaire, and it says, over the past 2 weeks, how often have you dealt with the following, rating them from 0 to 3. And as Shrijan Shen, who's here, has reported, most of what you do with this is not to give the last 2 weeks that are magically integrated in your mind, but it's affected by the end state, how have you been feeling in the last 2 hours, and any peak events, either high or low, that happened over the last 2 weeks. So it's not a particularly good measure, we know that anyway, but it's what we've had to work with. What we would need is something that's objective, that would be more continuous, not episodic, using a technology that would be available everywhere and use data that would be passive. So you can see where I'm going. This is the idea of digital phenotyping. You take these various signals that are available from a phone. Those include the sensors that can look at all the things I mentioned, activity, location, social behavior, voice and speech, where you can look at everything from the speed, the prosody of speech, the sentiment analysis. Are there more words that involve sadness or elation? Even the coherence, a really interesting way of trying to get at thought disorder. What I want to focus on is a third element that hasn't been developed so much, except it's what we do at MindStrong. It's this thing that we call human-computer interaction, or HCI, and it has to do with how you address the keyboard. Now, our technology actually came out of cybersecurity. Our founder was a CTO in a cybersecurity firm, and he developed this whole area of behavioral analytics. How do you track a hacker, no matter what their source address might be? And he discovered that we have these specific patterns, all of us, of how we scroll, how we type, how we go from spacebar to a letter or to any other part of the keyboard. You can capture all that and through machine learning begin to identify particular patterns and features. We call those digital biomarkers. And putting all these together create this kind of digital phenotype. A little deeper on this keyboard idea. One other thing to mention, this doesn't include, but it could include, looking at what we sometimes call digital exhaust, which is, these could be public social media posts, looking at your search behavior, whether that's on Google or Bing or some other search engine, or even looking at what you're saying to Siri or to Google Home or to Amazon Echo. These are getting really creepy when you get into this level of analysis, but if you just think about it for a moment, a huge amount of our lives are captured in this, and as people become depressed, manic, psychotic, you can imagine how much that would be confessed on any of these channels, whether it's digital exhaust or these passive digital measures. The way it works for the technology that we're interested in is that we we have about 45 different aspects of how you address the keyboard, like the latency between space and character or scroll to click kind of latencies. We turn that into a time series, so there are 23 signal processing transforms. So it's about 1,000 potential biomarkers. And then what we're interested in doing is validating those in clinical studies, either with looking at their psychometric properties, whether they correlate with any neural measures, or even in clinical studies, looking at how they match onto clinical constructs. Really, I'm going to take you through this quickly, but just a quick run through the data. The very first study that was done, self-funded by the founder, before we were actually even a company, it was to take 40 people collected off Craigslist, do a 4 or 5 hour neuropsychological battery as a gold standard with all the kinds of tests listed on the left, probably too small for you to see, but they capture memory, executive function, processing time, working memory, that kind of stuff. And then look at all these phone features, these 1,035 potential biomarkers, and ask with machine learning, do any of them map onto performance, to what we're picking up on a gold standard neuropsych battery? And you can see those bars are the significant, statistically significant places where there seems to be a signal. They cluster together interestingly. It's not to say this is actually something that will be useful, but it was the first hint that there might be a story in this. Fast forward about 2 years, instead of many other studies done in many other sites with lots of different population groups, and the data now are pretty interesting. You can go down these same neuropsychological traits like working memory and executive function and language and episodic memory, and we're able to now come up with features that replicate pretty well with an ability to predict performance using machine learning and hundreds of these digital biomarkers. That's about as good as the test-retest validity of the actual neuropsychological battery. So that gives us hope that this is an interesting way to at least look at cognitive traits. And some of these things like Trails B and some of the digit forward, digit backward tests have turned out to replicate very well as we've gone using the same features into new populations. Could do the same kind of work using neuroimaging, and here again we're able to find, if we take those traits or take those digital biomarkers that were linked to particular cognitive traits, they actually breed true, in fact, a little bit better, looking at connectomic signatures in a study done at Stanford. So in this case, just looking at these families of biomarkers for either cognitive control or reward, really large signals that correlate with individual differences in connectomics on the very brain targets that are involved with cognitive control and reward. So this gives us, we think, some validation from neuroimaging. And then more recently, looking at whether we can validate this through clinical trials and clinical constructs. And can we go from studying cognitive traits to really mood states? We've looked at people receiving ketamine for depression. This is rapid-acting antidepressant. We weren't that interested in the drug, but we were very interested in seeing what would track with these rapid changes in mood as you get this, because its effects are in place within about 6 hours. But the problem is that people relapse over the following few days. That's a problem clinically. It was an opportunity for us to be able to see, would there be digital features that would either correlate with the relapse or even predict the relapse and prove to be better than the Hamilton Depression Scale or a SHAPS measure of anhedonia. And I don't know how well you can see the brown are the digital biomarkers, the blue are the clinical ratings, but we get a pretty good map. It's not perfect. It doesn't have the same kind of range of fluctuation, but virtually every turn in mood we're picking up with a turn in these digital biomarkers. The statistical measure at the top is about 10 to the minus 27th, and for the SHAPS, that's for the Hamilton Depression Scale, for the SHAPS about 10 to the minus 20. So it's not, you can be misled by p-values. You've got to be really careful, and it's very easy to overfit these kinds of data. But as a start, it suggests that maybe this will be a useful tool to be able to ultimately replace what we're doing today for clinical ratings. The concept here being that we'll have a way to get at objective, continuous, ubiquitous, and even proactive measures, but they're all passive. We're not asking anybody to do anything except for the validation studies. And for a lot of what we're doing, it's actually content-free, so it doesn't have the sort of the creepiness factor of looking at somebody's search terms or what their social media posts might have looked like. That's not to say that that might not be useful, but it's kind of nice to be able to come up with a tool that could tell you a lot about how somebody's doing without having to actually look at the specific words that they're typing. Let's go on to talk a little bit about this other area, the interventions, because I think that's also where there's so far a lot more data and perhaps a lot more promise in this period of time. When John was mentioning that I left NIMH to move to Silicon Valley, and there was a quote I came across. Actually, I found this through a Tom Friedman article, op-ed that came out about the time I was starting to think about what I wanted to do with the next phase of my life. I was still at NIMH. And it was from Tom Goodwin, who was writing for TechCrunch. And I thought it was just really remarkable. This is now, almost 3 years ago. And the quote went something like this. It said that Uber owns no vehicles, Facebook creates no content, Alibaba, the most popular retailer, has no inventory. You could say that for Amazon as well. And Airbnb, largest accommodation provider, has no real estate. Something really interesting is happening here. And I got thinking about that. And this is a way of kind of introducing the idea of what would interventions look like in a world where we've begun to think of services very differently. We expect them to be focused on consumers, not on providers. We expect them to be virtual and on demand. We expect them to be transparent and that you get to shop across various vendors with the push of a button. Tremendous amount of information that's provided. And it is, in fact, proactive. That is, you can get to things very early. At the first time that you decide you want a new pair of shoes, you're on Amazon Prime and they're with you the next day. That is not what our healthcare system looks like. To say the very least, we've got a system that is focused, it's really built for providers and payers, not for patients. It's all about brick and mortar. Sometimes that's wonderful, like in the campus that we're on right now, but that's not the world that people are now more accustomed to, especially if they're under 20 and they grew up in an Amazon world. What we do is often very delayed. There's almost no transparency, so there's no real comparison shopping. You don't know what's going to cost until you get the bill, and even then, you don't know how many bills you're going to get. There's very little information that's available to the consumer, and it's entirely reactive. That is, we get involved when there's a problem. That's not the way to do healthcare, or maybe it's the way to do sickness care. It's not the way to do healthcare. We also have a range of opportunities with everything from video games written up in this Nature article to the assistants. This funny picture on the right of this woman in the vest who looks like a therapist is actually an avatar. It's this very interesting project out of University of Southern California to create an online social bot that will engage just as a therapist might. Some people like her better than a therapist, which is interesting. And then you've always got, virtual reality, which has been around for a long time. But boy, the virtual reality of 2018 does not look anything like virtual reality of 2008 or 1998. This is really an experience. If you haven't done it, it's a remarkably immersive experience with great potential for treating phobias and a number of other kinds of avoidant behaviors. Again, just to give you kind of my taxonomy of how to think about the interventions, there are going to be some that will be built for consumers that are probably going to be very helpful to help people manage themselves. Some of this will be around peer support and online psychotherapies and crisis intervention. There'll be a bunch of things for providers. Some of those will just be sort of better alert systems, better dashboards, so that you'll know which patients are having difficulty at a particular time. So I think it'll help with the whole issue of how we triage and how we monitor and do better with patients who may be not giving us a lot of information, or maybe we haven't been able to follow. You know, we know that after an emergency room visit for self-injury, that 52% of people are not seen again after being discharged for within 30 days. They just don't show up anywhere. But we also know that many of them are going to come back for another suicide attempt. And in fact, 1 in 5 of the people who die from suicide were seen in an emergency room for a self-harm event within the previous 12 months. So that's just egregious. They're there, they're making contact with the system, and yet they're lost to follow-up. So having better tools for this connected health could really make a difference. Some of that will be at the enterprise level as well, so that not just providers, but even payers and large healthcare systems can begin to do a better job of coordinating care, better job of not what we today use as electronic health records, but really deep, phenotypically rich ways of finding out what people are responding to, what they're not responding to, and maintaining this information over time. So we'll have a hopefully much better quality of care as well. Just give you a few examples of this. You probably all know about Crisis Text Line. It's particularly popular on college campuses, but what an amazing new effort. We've all, you know, I grew up kind of in the suicide hotline generation where we thought that was a great idea. But as you all know, college students do many, many, many things with their phones. Speaking on them is not one of them. So the use of the term phone is actually, it's a misnomer. These are very important computers with lots of capabilities, but very few people would think to, at least under the age of 25, would think to ever talk on them to anybody else. Texting is how they communicate, among other ways. So a suicide hotline is just not going to cut it for most students. Suicide text line makes a lot more sense. This is an enormous effort. As you can see here, 53 million messages. It's actually, this is a slightly old slide. It's probably well over 60 million by now. 2 million a month. They provide response within 90 seconds. Most interactions are not a single back and forth, but they go on for about 10 to 20 minutes. They say that they've had about 3,000 active rescues. What they do is they can contact 911 in any given location. And what they have is, you know, thousands of volunteers who've been trained up. It's a 40-hour training to be able to respond on a 24/7 basis to give this immediate access. They also have, they're also a very data-rich company, so they have an enormous database that they've made freely available to academics, and they can monitor, you know, where are people feeling pain, what are the complaints that are coming in. They can do that by time of day, time of the week, location of the country, all of those. It's an enormously interesting site to look at if you're not familiar with it. And of course, huge interest amongst campuses. Another example, one that I'm more involved with, so disclaimer there, is 7 Cups. This is an online global peer support system that, again, has been adopted by MIT and Virginia Commonwealth and UCSD, who white label it, so it's being used in lots of campuses already. But this is, I sometimes say this is like Facebook married to Alcoholics Anonymous. It's this wonderful mashup of using the social media approach that Facebook has, but instead of providing your idealized self, it's bringing your pain, just like you might do at an AA meeting, in an anonymous setting, and getting people on the site who have a problem and very quickly giving them the opportunity to help somebody else with the same problem. Tremendously empowering, very engaging. This is scaled in a way that's unbelievable. They're up to 2 million users a month. It graduates so that people can have what they call growth paths, so you can get coaching if you need it. There's online therapy with licensed therapists if you need it. There are something like 200,000 listeners who are like the equivalent of an AA sponsor, somebody who's there to be available to you as you need it. Very interesting concept, and seems to be a lot more appealing, particularly to people under the age of 25, than the brick and mortar concept that most of us are still stuck with. Finally, the coordination piece is pretty obvious, I think, in the kinds of things that can be done. The chance to create dashboards, telehealth, and use big data to improve this connectiveness. We talk about using an AI nurse as a kind of a first step to do triage. So this would be essentially a social bot that's available to respond and help with triage. Incredibly important to move to this world of measurement-based care. I frequently quote this line that we don't manage what we don't measure. And the fact is that in mental health, we have done a lousy job of measuring what we do. We don't measure outcomes. And so we don't know when people aren't getting better, which is one reason, I think, why we haven't done better to bend the curve for morbidity and mortality. And finally, it's a chance, I think, also to overcome fragmentation. And there are lots of companies that are working on better ways to link people with mental health issues to primary care, to other parts of the medical world where they just so far have not been able to get decent health care. And it's one of the reasons why people with serious mental illness die 20, 23 years earlier than the rest of us. It's not because of their schizophrenia or their bipolar illness, although sometimes it is if they suicide. It's most often because of pulmonary disease and metabolic disease and sometimes heart disease as well. So that's the landscape I wanted to share with you. The critical point to think about here is that what we can create is not just tools for each of these points on the triangle, but we can integrate them in a way that creates a kind of learning engine. A couple of people have asked me, what's the difference between being in government and being in Silicon Valley? And the facile answer is that you wear a hoodie to work and you get paid a lot better. But the real, and actually neither of those are true, by the way. The real answer is that the culture of Silicon Valley is this kind of learning culture, which is maybe the most important contribution, more than the technology that these companies like Google and Apple have introduced, and that is that they're constantly improving what they do. Google search, believe it or not, is changing every nanosecond. It's getting better and getting more developed based, even years into this, based on the billions of searches done every day. It's very different from, let's say, the pharmaceutical culture, which is you find a molecule you like, and you spend 15 to 20 years developing that molecule, and you don't touch it. You can't touch it once you've locked it in. That couldn't be more different. There's nothing in the Valley that stays the same over 15 to 17 or 15 to 20 hours. The best companies are changing their software on a daily basis. 7 Cups, the company I just mentioned, is phenomenal that way. I mean, what they do on Friday is not what they were doing on Monday. And they have about 200 therapists that they manage. They fire 10% of them every other month because they're not good enough. I don't know another part of the mental health care system that does that. So this data-driven learning process is incredibly exciting, and that's part of what this kind of an approach can offer that you don't see, I think, so much in the rest of healthcare. Let me give you just a couple of real quick examples. So if you think about how you could reduce suicide here, first you'd collect these predictive signals, so you move upstream, and that would be using the kind of data I talked about on the smartphone. You might be able to pick up speech signals where you'd know that there are particular signatures that involve an increase in risk. Maybe it's online classifiers. So if you start to see people searching for information that has to do with self-harm, how do I tie a hangman's noose? Today, they probably get advertisements for rope. We can do better than that, and we can turn that into part of what would be a kind of predictive risk analysis. What the intervention itself might look could be very different. It could be something that's much more like crisis text line, but where you have tools for those 3,000 volunteers that allow them in real time, by analyzing the calls or the texts coming in, to be able to know, is this someone at high risk or not? Because you use natural language processing tools to be able to identify those terms that involve high risk. You might think that's actually obvious and simple. Crisis text line started to do that. The number one term that was associated with needing an active rescue, when they went back and actually analyzed their tens of thousands of data on this, data points, was the term ibuprofen. And the term suicide actually was not in any way a risk factor. It did not increase, was not predictive of needing an active rescue. So there's a lot we can learn here, and a lot we're beginning to learn. This is a way of giving volunteers the skills that a clinical expert might have. I like to think about, could we build tools for mental health that look like Waze for traffic management, or for driving, for helping you to navigate? Could these be tools that would help any volunteer or any person in a community center who may not have gone to medical school, maybe didn't do a residency, but at least give them something they'll be able to navigate with, because they have the insights of an expert clinician. In the same way that Waze or Google Maps helps us to navigate a new city, even though we've maybe never been there. I don't think that's a fantasy. I think that needs to be done, and very much could be one way of getting at a problem like suicide. Postvention, of course, involves a whole range of the kinds of things I talked about around peer support, creating better care management, and this continuity of care that's currently missing. It's the same kinds of issues for preventing psychosis. These are things that, again, we're talking about the onset of a disorder that usually starts by age 20 or age 25, coming up with the right predictive signals, again, with the same sorts of measures, using semantics and natural language processing, potentially using wearables for monitoring sleep. Again, what do the interventions look like? Well, they may not be medicines. They may be video games. They could be aspects of supported employment that we can begin to operationalize and put on steroids with technology. And then taking what we know works, this coordinated specialty care, but again, making that a lot more economically viable by using technology. And then the opportunity to use technology to help families cope and to create the kinds of family support that is so far sadly missing. So all of this, I think, it made me very hopeful. I think it's a very exciting time, but it's important to realize that we are at the very beginning of what I think is probably a much longer journey. And for us to succeed in this, there really are going to be two measures that we're going to have to accomplish. The first is to demonstrate the value of using, whether it's phenotyping or digital interventions or the care management piece. And by that I mean, most people aren't looking for more data, they're looking for more efficacy, that is getting better outcomes. They're figuring out how to engage people and giving them something that they're actually interested in doing. One of the biggest problems with the internet CBT is that people stop after the first couple of episodes. It's just not that much fun. And one of the nice things about some of these kind of peer networks like Seven Cups, and the reason I think that MIT picked it up is they realized that it engaged people socially, and that's a lot of what their students were looking for. Efficiency, hugely important for any healthcare system. They are looking for how to do more with less. And if we can accomplish that, I think that'll be helpful. But it's only less than half the battle. The other half here is going to be creating trust. And this used to be a little easier than it is now. It was when I joined Google 2 years ago. Google and Facebook were kind of golden brands. Everybody wanted to work there, and everybody thought they were pretty wonderful. Now I think most people think of this as the greatest threat to the free world, and so we're struggling a lot with the trust factor in big tech companies. Here again, I think what we need to put in place is the transparency that is available, but is often not present in many of the products, giving people control over them so you can opt out, opt in at will, and making sure that there's the responsible use of data. So thinking very carefully about privacy, data ownership, how data gets shared, how data get used. A simple way for me in kind of boiling this down is to say, look, if we have as a guiding principle that we're trying to empower patients and families with information, I think we're going to stay on the right side of both the value and trust equation. But this is not yet done, and there are lots of ways this can go off track. So it's going to be very important for us to get this, to do this thoughtfully, carefully, and to do it successfully. I'll finish with a quote that I often use in talking about this, and I know that there's a huge sense of urgency in the room. We have to do better for depression on college campuses, but Bill Gates would tell you, if he were here, and maybe next year, John, you want to invite him, that we always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. Almost everything that we're dealing with on the technology side, the development of smartphones, the development of Facebook, the tremendous scale of something like Google search, all of this is 10 years old. Facebook was really, it went from universities to the private sector in 2007, end of 2007, almost shut down in 2009. So we're talking about, just remarkably short period of time in which so much has happened in technology. Where we'll be in 10 years is anybody's guess, but it's likely that things will certainly be much different in terms of what's available technologically, but also what's acceptable culturally. And I think all of us together, I hope, can start to get engaged in this so that we make it happen. This doesn't happen to us, but will become part of the change and ensure that those issues around both the efficacy and trust are kept very close at hand. So with that, let me stop and thank you, and hopefully we can take a few questions before we get on with the rest of the conference. Thanks very much. Oh, yep, the mics are out front of this section. So anybody, or you can just shout it out. Questions, thoughts, reactions?
Hello.
Yes.
I would love to hear more about the ibuprofen as a predictor.
Yeah. So why would that be? They were trying to figure that out, and actually it wasn't only ibuprofen, but there were a bunch of other words that kind of floated to the top as predictors. And those were mostly words that had to do with access to an immediate means of self-harm. So the specific question was something like, what's a lethal dose of ibuprofen? So Tylenol was in there as well, so I don't think there was any particular bias for ibuprofen as a product. But for drugs that were available, there were a couple of other terms, and there were also some weird things like what is it, IWKM, which I didn't know what that was, and they didn't either, but it stands for I want to kill myself. Some of the emojis turned out to be pretty good predictors. So just kind of really interesting insights that suggest to us that there's a whole realm of data that we can now begin to think about.
Thank you very much, Dr. Insel, for being here. So I work in a community public school system, and our parents often look at the phone or the device as the problem. And a piece that we try to talk about is kids aren't necessarily addicted to the phone as they are their relationships, their friends, and so on that they're often texting and working with. My question would be, when we're working with our parents or our kids and so on, how would you suggest we begin a conversation that hopes to open people up rather than stopping right there as if my kid would just put the device away everything would be great, to maybe a different type of conversation. So like a conversation starter. If you could help us with that, that'd be great. Thanks for your time here.
You probably would do better at that than I would. I mean, I can tell you, as difficult as you may think it is with high school students, I have grandchildren who have started using phones to play games and other things at age 4. And by the time they're 6, especially the boys, for whatever reason, they are really hooked. And it's incredibly difficult when we now have a generation that started even earlier to get them off. This isn't even using them for social connections, but just for, there's a whole new thing called Twitch. You know what Twitch is? Does anybody know what Twitch is? It's just like this really strange thing that the hot new thing with your phone is to go on, it's a YouTube site where you watch other people play games. And it's, and they're now gamers who are like major sports figures who are making phenomenal amounts of money by playing games on YouTube and then demonstrating, their ability to win at Destiny or whatever game you might be interested in. And kids have really gotten hooked on it's like a form of watching sports, except it's watching someone play a video game online, which is just mind-boggling to me that would be interesting, but it is. So, I think your comment of using it as a conversation starter is certainly right on. I'll tell you that this is a tough force that we're dealing with. It's not going to be easy to move kids. These are like, what do they call? They used to call the BlackBerry the crackberry. I mean, this really has this enormously powerful addictive force, and I don't know that I have any good answers about how to wean kids off. What we're really trying to do is to say, it's like an Aikido move. Can we take this problem and flip it into a solution by starting to grab the data and understanding more about when and how and where and what's the impact and all of that, and then feed that data back to say, ooh, it looks like there may be a better way to do this, or if you want to go to college, this is going to be a problem given these kinds of data. But gosh, there's not going to be a simple solution, or as I like to say, there's no app for that. So I feel your pain. I think conversation starter is the place to begin, though. Yes?
If you find one, tell us.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed the presentation, and I've been sitting here rehearsing this question, and I still haven't gotten it down. So I'm just going to ask it the way I've been thinking about it. Is like, if you, instead of doing the test or the study with college students, or if you'd done it with like juniors or seniors in high school, do you think the results would differ?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I don't know the answer. We intend to do that. We're just starting to work with kids who have a family history of depression and who are at high risk for that, starting at age 10, and then following them through. But my guess is that the signals will be different for kids in high school versus kids in college versus adults. And the place where we've had the greatest problem is in people in my age bracket. We just don't get enough data. They're not on their phones enough, so they use, like me, we use our, it's like old school, but we tend to use laptops instead of, or iPads instead of phones. And so that we just don't, there isn't enough data coming through every day to be able to get a lot of information. But I think for kids, it'll be overwhelming how much we'll see. Yeah.
I'm Mark Creekmore, president of the Washington affiliated National Alliance on Mental Illness. And I have a lot of resonance in what you say because NAMI, as a peer-led grassroots organization, has a very interesting relationship with formal care providers. And the area that you're talking about that resonates most in my experience is with the notion of confidentiality. One set of the professional providers are restrained by law and professional norms for encouraging people to break confidence. NAMI, on the other hand, says our stories are our most powerful form of advocacy. So it's important to tell those stories, and we encourage people to formulate and tell their own stories and use their stories in conscious and careful ways. But still, it's the relationship between information. One is very protected, and the other is really dealing with it as a commodity of change and a commodity of personal expression. So I think you know we're the National Institute of Mental Health outreach partner, and we were discussing in Washington last year the all of us effort to gather data, which encourages people to share their entire medical records in perpetuity, essentially, so the data can be gathered and accommodated. So the two areas of, I mean, you touched it with trust, but the two areas are so the question really, if I could boil it, sorry I'm going on, but the question is, how do you go from one that's a siloed, protected environment to one which doesn't care so much about
Yes, this is like an incredibly important question. I'm so glad you asked it, and it really needs to be talked about at the meeting. I can't remember if it's on the agenda, but where this really plays out is on the college campus, where the campus mental health workers feel that they can't contact parents even when there could be a very severe problem. One way that some of the schools are dealing with this, especially once the kids are over 18, right? So one way that some campuses are dealing with this is they're having incoming freshmen sign a document that essentially gives the university the legal right to contact parents under any concern about health issues. It's been less of an issue when a kid breaks a leg, but for mental health in particular, the way that HIPAA works, it's different from state to state, but there are real concerns about sharing information. So there's no problem, though, if you have a kind of mental health advance directive, which probably every school should do, but it's only been tried in a few places, and incredibly important. So you can get around that issue of trust by making sure that at least legally, the university can contact parents and can contact providers who might be outside the system when there's a concern about any student. But you're right. This whole issue about what gets communicated, how, and by whom, it's a harder issue here than it is in any other area of medicine. And unfortunately, the legal framework is also a little murky. At least it doesn't have to be, but it's been complicated by different interpretations of what HIPAA allows and what it doesn't. My reading of it is that it allows a lot of sharing, but mostly if there's some sort of preemptive disclosure and an opportunity to provide these kinds of advanced directives, which I think every university ought to do.
Hi there. Thank you for providing the information today. I'm staff psychologist at a big university in New York, and so the supply-demand piece is resonating with me. I'm curious about your thoughts on, or any research that you've found about clients or persons who are more likely to utilize the resources that you've provided here. So differentiators and like person or client profiles, because resistance to treatment and nutrition does occur, and so I'm just wondering about persons who are more likely to gravitate toward these interventions versus persons who are not.
Yeah, so good question. We know that of the interventions I showed for crisis text line and 7 cups, it's a young crowd. Now, they both have people in every decade of life who've used it, but by far and away, the predominant groups are under 30. The really curious thing about this is that it's often underserved minority populations that gravitate to. One of the most active, they have these user groups within 7 Cups. One of the most active groups is young African-American men. And they have their own community. They're called communities there. And I've tried to understand why that is, and what they tell me is that it's because there aren't a lot of other options for them. This provides an anonymous place they can come together, talk about these issues, and they don't feel they can do that with brick and mortar care. So, the universities that have adopted this, I think, have seen a broad range of campus engaged. I don't know if there's anybody here from any of the universities. They basically white label 7 Cups, so it says MIT, it doesn't say 7 Cups when you go to their site, but it's the same site with all the back end being done through the company. So I think within that age range, you're getting a very good, as far as I can tell, there isn't a segment that's not engaged, but when you get into older groups, it really falls off quickly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I think you get the last one, and then we'll have, in a break, you can catch.
Okay.
As a student activist on a college campus and a NAMI peer support group, how would you suggest going about promoting the use of the technology for mental health?
Yeah, so I'm not sure it needs a lot of promotion. A lot of times people simply don't know about it. So a lot of it, and I'm always surprised that it's so funny. I talk to a lot of groups like this, and it tends to be the people on the front lines in the community know about crisis text line. People at universities know nothing about it. So these things are growing virally. I'm not sure it needs a lot of push, because this is unlike everything else we do. People seem to really like this. The Silicon Valley term is they grok this or grok with this. So it's maybe easy enough to get engagement, but there does need to be awareness. So I think getting the name out there, and it's not, I just use those 2 as examples. There's so much going on, and there are groups like Active Minds and JED Foundation and many, many others that are on campuses across the country that are going to be good resources for providing both online and offline help. So the great thing here is that the table's set. There's just a lot more choices than we would have had a decade ago. I had that picture in there, is this the solution, showing a single therapist with a single student in a campus clinic. That's a great model. It doesn't scale very well. That's the supply-demand problem. We're still going to need real people giving real help to real kids. So there's got to be a high-touch part to this. But what high tech does is it allows you to accelerate that and to scale it in ways that kind of provide a funnel. So I think what you're seeing with with Crisis Text Line 7 Cups, Big White Wall, all these others that are available, is building that funnel in and giving people something that can help them until they may need in-person treatment. So I would say get the word out, make sure people know about what's available, and also get responses back. Find out as much as you can about, was it helpful, what was the experience, what worked, what didn't. All of these companies are trying to improve what they do, and they love to get feedback. That's that learning culture that drives everything here. So that's why I'm so hopeful. I think that having people like you and having all these resources, maybe we'll finally begin to really make a difference, and certainly it can't happen fast enough. Thank you.
Thank you.
So 2 things. One, you're in a now shorter break. You'll hear some notification, but there is a break. 2 is that listening to these questions and Tom's answers, I have a challenge for all of you, which is during the span of this meeting, please go back and talk to each other and then submit something, give it to the desk out there as to what you think would be the most important things that college leadership could do. President Schlissel was sitting over here behind us listening to Tom's talk. He left a little while ago. But let's give some feedback as to what you think are the most important messages about how we use digital tools and media and some of the strategies that are being discussed. And finally, join me once more in thanking Dr. Tom Insel.